64. How to expose a charlatan. Forer effect. Dear listener, it may surprise you, but I know you personally. This is how I would sum you up. You have a great need for other people to like and admire you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. While you have some personality weaknesses, you're generally able to compensate for them. Your sexual adjustment has presented problems for you. Disciplined and self-controlled outside, you tend to be worrisome and insecure inside. At times you have serious doubts as to whether you have made the right decision or done the right thing. You prefer a certain amount of change and variety and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. You pride yourself as an independent thinker and don't accept others' statements without satisfactory proof. You have found it unwise to be too frank in revealing yourself to others. At times you're extroverted, affable, and sociable, while at other times you're introverted, wary, and reserved. Some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic. Security is one of your major goals in life. Do you recognize yourself? On a scale from 1, poor, to 5, excellent, how was my assessment? In 1948, psychologist Bertram Forer crafted this exact passage using astrology columns from various magazines. He then gave it to his students to read, suggesting that each person was getting a personalized assessment. On average, the students rated their characterizations 4.3 out of 5. That is, they gave Forer an accuracy score of 86%. The experiment was repeated hundreds of times in the decades that followed, with virtually identical results. Most likely, you gave the text a 4 or 5 too. People tend to identify many of their own traits in such universal descriptions. Science labels this tendency the Forer effect, or the Barnum effect. The Forer effect explains why the pseudosciences work so well. Astrology, astrotherapy, the study of handwriting, biorhythm analysis, palmistry, tarot card readings, and seances with the dead. What's behind the Forer effect? First, the majority of statements in Forer's passage are so general that they relate to everyone. Sometimes you seriously doubt your actions. Who doesn't? Second, we tend to accept flattering statements that don't apply to us. You are proud of your independent thinking. Obviously, who sees himself or herself as a mindless follower? Third, the so-called feature positive effect plays a part. The text contains no negative statements. It states only what we are, even though the absence of characteristics is an equally important part of a person's makeup. Fourth, the father of all the fallacies, the confirmation bias. We accept whatever corresponds to our self-image and unconsciously filter everything else out. What remains is a coherent portrait. Whatever tricks astrologers and palm readers can turn, consultants and analysts can too. The stock has significant growth potential even in a very competitive environment. The company lacks the necessary impetus to fully realize and implement ideas from the development team. Management is made up of experienced industry professionals. However, hints of bureaucratization are noticeable. A look at the profit and loss statement clearly shows that savings can be made. We advise the company to focus even more closely on emerging economies to secure future market share. Sounds about right, no? How do you rate the quality of such a guru? For example, an astrologer. Pick 20 people and secretly assign each a number. Have him characterize the people and write his assessments down on cards. To ensure anonymity, participants never find out their numbers. Afterward, each receives a copy of all the cards. Only when the majority of people identify their description is their real talent at hand. I'm still waiting. 65. Volunteer work is for the birds. Volunteer's folly. Jack, a photographer, is on the go from Monday to Friday. Commissioned by fashion magazines, he divides his time between Milan, Paris, and New York, and is constantly in search of the most beautiful girls, the most original designs, and the perfect light. He's well known on the social circuit, and the money is great. $500 an hour. Easy. That's as much as a commercial lawyer, he brags to his buddies, and what I have in front of my lens looks a lot better than any banker. Jack leads an enviable life, but lately he's become more philosophical. It feels as if something has come between him and the fashion world. The selfishness of the industry suddenly repels him. Sometimes he lies in bed staring at the ceiling and yearns for more meaningful work. He'd like to be selfless once again, to contribute something to the world, no matter how small. One day his phone rings. It's Patrick, his former classmate and current president of the local bird club. Next Sunday, we're having our annual birdhouse drive. We're looking for volunteers to help us build birdhouses for endangered species. Afterward, we'll put them up in the woods. Do you have any time? We're meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning. We should be done shortly after noon. What would Jack say if he really is serious about creating a better world? That's right. He should turn down the request. Why? Jack earns $500 an hour. A carpenter, $50. It would be much more sensible to work an extra hour as a photographer and then hire a professional carpenter for 6 hours to make good quality birdhouses, which Jack could never hope to accomplish. Taxes aside, he could donate the difference, $200 to the bird club. Doing so, his contribution would go much further than if he grabbed a saw and rolled up his sleeves. Nevertheless, it's highly likely that Jack will turn up bright and early next Saturday to build birdhouses. Economists call this volunteer's folly. It's a popular phenomenon. More than 1/4 of Americans volunteer their time. But what makes it folly? Among other things, if Jack chooses to cobble together a few birdhouses himself, it takes away work from a tradesman. Working a little longer and donating a portion of the earnings is the most effective contribution Jack can make. Hands-on volunteer work would be helpful only if he could make use of his expertise. If the bird club were planning a fundraising mail campaign and needed a professional photo, Jack could either shoot it himself or work an hour longer to hire another top photographer and donate the remainder. So now we come to the thorny topic of altruism. Does selflessness exist at all, or is it merely a balm to our egos? Although a desire to help the community motivates many volunteers, personal benefits play a big part, such as gaining skills, experience, and contacts. Suddenly, we're not acting quite so selflessly. Indeed, many volunteers engage in what might be deemed personal happiness management, the benefits of which are sometimes far removed from the real cause. Strictly speaking, anyone who profits or feels even the slightest satisfaction from volunteering is not a pure altruist. So does it mean Jack is a fool if he turns up, hammer in hand, on Saturday morning? Not necessarily. There is one group exempt from volunteers' folly: celebrities. If Bono, Kate Winslet, and Mark Zuckerberg pose for photos while making birdhouses, cleaning oil-stained beaches, or digging for earthquake victims, they lend something priceless to the situation: publicity. Therefore, Jack must critically assess whether he is famous enough to make his participation worthwhile. The same applies to you and me. If people don't double-take when they pass you on the street, the best way to contribute is with greenbacks rather than greenhorn labor. 66. Why you're a slave to your emotions. Affect heuristic. What do you think of genetically modified wheat? It's a complex issue. You don't want to answer too hastily. A rational approach would be to consider the controversial technology's pros and cons separately. Write down the possible benefits, weigh them in terms of importance, and then multiply them by the probability that they will occur. Doing so, you get a list of expected values. Next, do the same with the cons. List all the disadvantages, estimate their potential damage, and multiply them by the likelihood of them happening. The positive sum minus the negative sum equals the net expected value. If it's above zero, you are in favor of genetically modified wheat. If the sum is below zero, you're against it. More than likely, you've already heard of this approach. It's called expected value, and it features in most literature on decision theory. But just as probable is that you've never bothered to carry out such an evaluation. And without a doubt, none of the professors who wrote the textbooks turned to this method to select their spouses. Truth be told, no one uses this method to make decisions. First of all, we lack enough imagination to list all the possible pros and cons. We're limited by what springs to mind. We can only conjure up what we have seen in our modest experience. It's hard to imagine a storm of the century if you're only 30 years old. Second, calculating small probabilities is impossible because we don't have enough data on rare events. The smaller the probability, the fewer data points we have, and the higher the error rate on the exact probability, a vicious effect. Third, our brain is not built for such calculations. They require time and effort, not our preferred state. In our evolutionary past, whoever thought too long and hard vanished inside a predator's jaws. We are the descendants of quick decision makers, and we rely on mental shortcuts called heuristics. One of the most popular is the affect heuristic. An affect is a momentary judgment, something you like or dislike. The word gunfire triggers a negative effect. The word luxury produces a positive one. This automatic one-dimensional impulse prevents you from considering risks and benefits to be independent variables, which indeed they are. Instead, the affect heuristic puts risks and benefits on the same sensory thread. Your emotional reactions to issues such as nuclear power, organic vegetables, private schools, or motorbikes determine how you assess their risks and benefits. If you like something, you believe that the risks are smaller and the benefits greater than they actually are. If you don't like something, the opposite is true. Risks and benefits appear to be dependent. Of course, in reality, they're not. Even more impressive, suppose you own a Harley Davidson. If you come across a study that states that driving one is riskier than previously thought, you will subconsciously tweak how you rate the benefits, deeming the experience an even greater sense of freedom. But how does an affect, the initial spontaneous emotion, come to be? Researchers at the University of Michigan flashed one of three images for less than 1/100th of a second in front of participants: a smiling face, an angry face, or a neutral figure. The subjects then had to indicate whether they liked a randomly selected Chinese character or not. The participants didn't speak Chinese. Most preferred symbols that immediately followed the smiling face. Seemingly insignificant factors influence our emotions. Here's another example where an insignificant factor plays a role. Researchers David Hirschleifer and Tyler Shumway tested the relationship between the amount of morning sun and daily market performance in 26 major stock exchanges between 1982 and 1997. They found a correlation that reads much like a farmer's adage. If the sun is shining in the morning, the stock market will rise during the day. Not always, but often. Who would have thought that sunshine can move billions? The morning sun obviously has the same effect as a smiley face. Whether we like it or not, we're puppets of our emotions. We make complex decisions by consulting our feelings, not our thoughts. Against our best intentions, we substitute the question, "What do I think about this?" with, "How do I feel about this?" So smile. Your future depends on it. 67. Be your own heretic. Introspection illusion. Bruce is in the vitamin business. His father founded the company when supplements were not yet a lifestyle product. A doctor had to prescribe them. When Bruce took over the operation in the early 90s, demand skyrocketed. Bruce seized the opportunity with both hands and took out huge loans to expand production. Today, he's one of the most successful people in the business and president of a National Association of Vitamin Manufacturers. Since childhood, hardly a day has passed without him swallowing at least 3 multivitamins. A journalist once asked him if they do anything. He replied, "I'm sure of it." Do you believe him? I have another question for you. Take any idea you are 100% sure of. Perhaps that gold will rise over the next 5 years. Perhaps that God exists. Perhaps that your dentist is overcharging you. Whatever the belief, write it down in one sentence. Do you believe yourself? I bet you consider your conviction more valid than Bruce's, right? Here's why. Yours is an internal observation, whereas Bruce's is external. Crudely put, you can peek into your own soul, but not into his. In Bruce's case, you might think, come on. It's obviously in his interest to believe that vitamins are beneficial. After all, his wealth and social status depend on the success of the company. He has to maintain a family tradition. All his life, he's gulped down pills. So he'll never admit that it was a waste of time. For you, however, it's a different story. You have searched deep inside. You are completely impartial. But how pure and honest is internal reflection? The Swedish psychologist Peter Johansson allowed test subjects to glimpse 2 portrait photos of random people and choose which face was more attractive. Then he showed them the preferred photo up close and asked them to describe the most attractive features. However, with a sleight of hand, he switched the pictures. Most participants failed to notice and proceeded to justify in detail why they favored the image. The results of the study? Introspection is not reliable. When we soul search, we contrive the findings. The belief that reflection leads to truth or accuracy is called the introspection illusion. This is more than sophistry. Because we're so confident of our beliefs, we experience 3 reactions when someone fails to share our views. Response 1, assumption of ignorance. The other party clearly lacks the necessary information. If he knew what you know, he would be of the same opinion. Political activists think this way. They believe they can win others over through enlightenment. Reaction 2, assumption of idiocy. The other person has the necessary information, but his mind is underdeveloped. He cannot draw the obvious conclusions. In other words, he's a moron. This reaction is particularly popular with bureaucrats who want to protect stupid consumers from themselves. Response 3, assumption of malice. Your counterpart has the necessary information. He even understands the debate, but he is deliberately confrontational. He has evil intentions. This is how many religious leaders and followers treat disbelievers. If they don't agree, they must be servants of the devil. In conclusion, nothing is more convincing than your own beliefs. We believe that introspection unearths genuine self-knowledge. Unfortunately, introspection is, in large part, fabrication, posing 2 dangers. First, the introspection illusion creates inaccurate predictions of future mental states. Trust your internal observations too much and too long, and you might be in for a very rude awakening. Second, we believe that our introspections are more reliable than those of others, which creates an illusion of superiority. Remedy? Be all the more critical with yourself. Regard your internal observations with the same skepticism as claims from some random person. Become your own toughest critic. 68. Why you should set fire to your ships. Inability to close doors. Next to my bed, 24 books are stacked high. I have dipped in and out of all of them, but am unable to part with even one. I know that sporadic reading won't help me achieve any real insights, despite the many hours I put in, and that I really should devote myself to one book at a time. So why am I still juggling all 24? I know a man who is dating 3 women. He's in love with all 3 and can imagine starting a family with any of them. However, he simply doesn't have the heart to choose just one, because then he would be passing up on the other 2 for good. If he refrains from deciding, all options remain open. The downside is that no real relationship will develop. In the 3rd century BC, General Zhang Yu sent his army across the Yangtze River to take on the Qin dynasty. While his troops slept, he ordered all the ships to be set alight. The next day he told them, "You now have a choice. Either you fight to win, or you die." By removing the option of retreat, he switched their focus to the only thing that mattered, the battle. Spanish conquistador Cortés used the same motivational trick in the 16th century. After landing on the east coast of Mexico, he sank his own ship. Zhang Yu and Cortés are exceptions. We mere mortals do everything we can to keep open the maximum number of options. Psychology professors Dan Ariely and Ji Weng-shin demonstrated the strength of this instinct using a computer game. Players started with 100 points, and on the screen in front of them, 3 doors appeared, a red one, a blue one, and a green one. Opening a door cost a point, but for every room they entered, they could accrue more points. The players reacted logically. They found the most fruitful room and holed up there for the whole session. Ariely and Shin then changed the rules. If doors were not opened within 12 moves, they started shrinking on the screen and eventually vanished. Players now rushed from door to door to secure access to all potential treasure troves. All this unproductive scrambling meant they scored 15% fewer points than in the previous game. The organizers then added another twist. Opening doors now cost 3 points. The same anxiety kicked in. Players frittered away their points, trying to keep all doors open. Even when the subjects learned how many points were hidden in each room, nothing changed. Sacrificing options was a price they were not willing to pay. Why do we act so irrationally? Because the downside to such behavior is not always apparent. In the financial markets, things are clear. A financial option on a security always costs something. There is no such thing as a free option. In most other realms, however, options seem to be free. But this is an illusion. They also come at a price, but the price tag is often hidden and intangible. Each decision costs mental energy and eats up precious time for thinking and living. CEOs who examine every possible expansion option often choose none in the end. Companies that aim to address all customer segments end up addressing no one. Salespeople who chase every single lead close no deals. We're obsessed with having as many irons as possible in the fire, ruling nothing out and being open to everything. However, this can easily destroy success. We must learn to close doors. A business strategy is primarily a statement on what not to engage in. Adopt a life strategy similar to a corporate strategy. Write down what not to pursue in your life. In other words, make calculated decisions to disregard certain possibilities, and when an option shows up, test it against your not to pursue list. It will not only keep you from trouble, but also save you lots of thinking time. Think hard once, and then just consult your list, instead of having to make up your mind whenever a new door cracks open. Most doors are not worth entering, even when the handle seems to turn so effortlessly. 69. Disregard the brand new. Neomania. How will the world look in 50 years? What will your everyday life be like? With which items will you surround yourself? People who pondered this question 50 years ago had fanciful notions of how the future would look. Highways in the skies, cities that resemble glass worlds, bullet trains winding between gleaming skyscrapers. We would live in plastic capsules, work in underground cities, vacation on the moon, and consume everything in pill form. We wouldn't conceive offspring anymore. Instead, we would choose children from a catalog. Our best friends would be robots. Death would be cured, and we would have exchanged our bikes for jetpacks long ago. But hang on a second. Take a look around. You're sitting in a chair, an invention from ancient Egypt. You wear pants, developed about 5,000 years ago and adapted by Germanic tribes around 750 BC. The idea behind your leather shoes comes from the last ice age. Your bookshelves are made of wood, one of the oldest building materials in the world. At dinner time, you use a fork, a well-known killer app from Roman times, to shovel chunks of dead animals and plants into your mouths. Nothing has changed. How will the world look in 50 years? In his latest book, Anti-Fragile, Nassim Taleb gives us a clue. Assume that most of the technology that has existed for the past 50 years will serve us for another half-century. And assume that recent technology will be passé in a few years' time. Why? Think of these inventions as if they were species. Whatever has held its own throughout centuries of innovation will probably continue to do so in the future too. Old technology has proven itself. It possesses an inherent logic, even if we don't always understand it. If something has endured for epochs, it must be worth its salt. You can take this to heart the next time you're in a strategy meeting. 50 years into the future will look a lot like today. Of course, you'll witness the birth of many flashy gadgets and magic contraptions, but most will be short-lived. When contemplating the future, we place far too much emphasis on flavor-of-the-month inventions and the latest killer apps, while underestimating the role of traditional technology. In the 1960s, space travel was all the rage, so we imagined ourselves on school trips to Mars. In the 70s, plastic was in, so we mulled over how we would furnish our see-through houses. Taleb traces this tendency back to the neo-mania pitfall, the mania for all things shiny and new. In the past, I sympathized with the so-called early adopters, the breed of people who cannot survive without the latest iPhone. I thought they were ahead of their time. Now I regard them as irrational and suffering from a kind of sickness, neo-mania. To them, it's of minor importance if an invention provides tangible benefits. Novelty matters more. So don't go out on a limb when forecasting the future. Stanley Kubrick's cult movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, illustrates why you shouldn't. Made in 1968, the movie predicted that, at the turn of the millennium, the United States would have a 1,000-strong colony on the moon, and that Pan Am would operate the commuter flights there and back. With this fanciful forecast in mind, I suggest a rule of thumb. Whatever has survived for X years will last another X years. Taleb wagers that the bullshit filter of history will sort the gimmicks from the game changers. And that's one bet I'm willing to back. 70. Why propaganda works. Sleeper effect. During World War II, every nation produced propaganda movies. These were devised to fill the population, especially soldiers, with enthusiasm for their country and, if necessary, to bolster them to lay down their lives. The United States spent so much money on propaganda that the War Department decided to find out whether the expense was really worth it. A number of studies were carried out to investigate how the movies affected regular soldiers. The result was disappointing. They did not intensify the privates' enthusiasm for war in the slightest. Was it because they were poorly made? Hardly. Rather, the soldiers were aware that the movies were propaganda, which discredited their message even before they were rolling. Even if the movie argued a point reasonably or managed to stir the audience, it didn't matter. Its content was deemed hollow from the outset and dismissed. 9 weeks later, something unexpected happened. The psychologists measured the soldiers' attitudes a second time. The result: whoever had seen the movie expressed much more support for the war than those who had not viewed it. Apparently, propaganda did work after all. The scientists were baffled, especially since they knew that an argument's persuasiveness decreased over time. It has a half-life like a radioactive substance. Surely you've experienced this yourself. Let's say you read an article on the benefits of gene therapy. Immediately after reading it, you're a zealous convert. But after a few weeks, you don't really remember why. More time passes until only a tiny fraction of enthusiasm remains. Amazingly, just the opposite is true for propaganda. If it strikes a chord with someone, this influence will only increase over time. Why? Psychologist Carl Hovland, who led the study for the War Department, named this phenomenon the sleeper effect. To date, the best explanation is that in our memories, the source of the argument fades faster than the argument. In other words, your brain quickly forgets where the information came from, such as from the Department of Propaganda. Meanwhile, the message itself, that is, war is necessary and noble, fades only slowly or even endures. Therefore, any knowledge that stems from an untrustworthy source gains credibility over time. The discrediting force melts away faster than the message does. In the United States, elections increasingly revolve around nasty advertisements. in which candidates seek to tarnish one another's record or reputation. However, by law, each political ad must disclose its sponsor at the end so that it is clearly distinguishable as an electioneering message. However, countless studies show that the sleeper effect does its job here too, especially among undecided voters. The messenger fades from memory. The ugly accusations persevere. I've often wondered why advertising works at all. Any logical person must recognize ads for what they are and suitably categorize and disqualify them. But even you, as a discerning and intelligent listener, won't always succeed at this. It's quite possible that after a few weeks, you won't remember if you picked up certain information from a well-researched article or from a tacky advertorial. How can you thwart the sleeper effect? First, don't accept any unsolicited advice, even if it seems well-meant. Doing so, you protect yourself, to a certain degree, from manipulation. Second, avoid ad-contaminated sources like the play. How fortunate we are that books are still ad-free. Third, try to remember the source of every argument you encounter. Whose opinions are these? And why do they think that way? Probe the issue like an investigator would. Cui bono? Who benefits? Admittedly, this is a lot of work and will slow down your decision-making, but it will also refine it. 71. Why it's never just a two-horse race. Alternative blindness. You leaf through a brochure that gushes about the benefits of the university's MBA degree. Your gaze sweeps over photos of the ivy-colored campus and the ultra-modern sports facilities. Sprinkled throughout are images of smiling students from various ethnic backgrounds with an emphasis on young women, young Chinese, and young Indian go-getters. On the last page, you come to an overview that illustrates the financial value of an MBA. The $100,000 fee is easily offset by the statistical extra income that graduates earn before they retire, $400,000 after taxes. Who wouldn't want to be up $300,000? It's a no-brainer. Wrong. Such an argument hides not one but four fallacies. First, we have the swimmer's body illusion. MBA programs attract career-oriented people who will probably earn above-average salaries at some stage of their careers, even without the extra qualification of an MBA. The second fallacy, an MBA takes 2 years. During this time, you can expect a loss of earnings, say $100,000. So in fact, the MBA costs $200,000, not $100,000. That amount, if invested well, could easily exceed the additional income that the brochure promises. Third, to estimate earnings that are more than 30 years away is idiotic. Who knows what will happen over the next 3 decades? Finally, other alternatives exist. You are not stuck between do an MBA and don't do an MBA. Perhaps you can find a different program that costs significantly less and also represents a shot in the arm for your career. This fourth misconception interests me the most. Let's call it alternative blindness. We systematically forget to compare an existing offer with the next best alternative. Here's an example from the world of finance. Suppose you have a little money in your savings account and you ask your investment broker for advice. He proposes a bond that will earn you 5% interest. That's much better than the 1% you get with your savings account, he points out. Does it make sense to buy the bond? We don't know. It's wrong to consider just these two options. To assess your options properly, you would have to compare the bond with all other investment options and then select the best. This is how top investor Warren Buffett does things. Each deal we measure against the second best deal that is available at any given time, even if it means doing more of what we're already doing. Unlike Warren Buffett, politicians often fall victim to alternative blindness. Let's say your city is planning to build a sports arena on a vacant plot of land. Supporters argue that such an arena would benefit the population much more than an empty lot, both emotionally and financially. But this comparison is wrong. They should compare the construction of the sports arena with all other ideas that become impossible due to its construction. For example, building a school, a performing arts center, a hospital, or an incinerator. They could also sell the land and invest the proceeds or reduce the city's debt. And you? Do you often overlook the alternatives? Let's say your doctor discovers a tumor that will kill you in 5 years. He proposes a complicated operation that, if successful, removes the tumor completely. However, this procedure is highly risky, with a survival rate of just 50%. How do you decide? You weigh up your choices. Certain death in 5 years, or a 50% chance of dying next week. Alternative blindness. Perhaps there is a variant of the invasive surgery that your hospital doesn't offer, but a hospital across town does. This invasive surgery might not remove the tumor altogether, just slow its growth, but is much safer and gives you an extra 10 years. And who knows? Maybe during these 10 years a more sophisticated therapy for eradicating tumors will be made available. The bottom line? If you have trouble making a decision, remember that the choices are broader than no surgery or highly risky surgery. Forget about the rock and the hard place, and open your eyes to the other, superior alternatives. 72. Why we take aim at young guns. Social comparison bias. As one of my books reached #1 on the bestseller list, my publisher asked me for a favor. An acquaintance's title was on the verge of entering the top 10 list, and the publisher was convinced that a testimonial from me would give it the necessary push. It always amazes me that these little testimonials work at all. Everyone knows that only favorable comments end up on a book's jacket. The book you hold in your hands is no exception. A rational reader should ignore the praise, or at least consider it alongside the criticism, which is always available, albeit in different places. Nevertheless, I've written plenty of testimonials for other books, but they were never for rival titles. I hesitated. Wouldn't writing a blurb be cutting off my nose to spite my face? Why should I help someone who might soon vie for the top slot? As I pondered the question, I realized social comparison bias has kicked in. That is, the tendency to withhold assistance to people who might outdo you, even if you look like a fool in the long run. Book testimonials are a harmless example of the social comparison bias. However, the phenomenon has reached toxic levels in academia. Every scientist's goal is to publish as many articles as possible in the most prestigious scientific journals. Over time, you make a name for yourself, and soon editors ask you to assess other scientists' submissions. In the end, often just 2 or 3 experts decide what gets published in a particular field. Taking this into account, what happens if a young researcher sends in an earth-shattering paper that turns the entire department on its head and threatens to knock them off their thrones? They will be especially rigorous when evaluating the article. That's social comparison bias, hard at work. The psychologist Stephen Garcia and his fellow researchers described the case of a Nobel laureate who prevented a promising young colleague from applying for a job at his university. This may seem judicious in the short term, but in the long run, it's counterproductive. What happens when that young prodigy joins another research group and applies his acumen there, most likely depriving the old institution of maintaining its world-class status? Garcia suggests that social comparison bias may well be the reason why hardly any research groups remain